Gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Secretary, let's come at this from a slightly different perspective, but along the lines of my colleagues. You've used the phrase in practice several times, and I appreciate that tremendously, because this is not just an academic exercise. There are practical consequences to everything we do. My constituents, the small financial institutions and what some would define as non-traditional institutions out in the countryside, are very nervous about the Consumer Protection Agency bill. And their nervousness is not, I think, so much about protecting the consumer. They all support that. But there is a fear out there in the countryside, and this comes before Chairman Frank's memo. There's a fear out in the countryside that the biggest institutions in this country, with larger staffs, with greater budgets, with greater volumes of business, will have the ability to meet these standards in a more cost-effective way than they will be. And that the ultimate net result, at least of the Consumer Financial Protection Agency as envisioned by the administration, will be to raise their costs disproportionately to the bigger institutions. And they are very concerned about that out there. And that's an issue I think we need to address as we move through this process. And to touch on a slightly different subject, and then whatever comments you might have, sir, on the derivative side of the equation. Sitting on the Ag Committee, we have a little bit of involvement in those issues. I have a number of constituents and constituent industries back home in Oklahoma that use these kind of products to provide some sort of price stability for the commodities they sell over the period of time. Otherwise, they're a day-to-day price, and that's a very difficult thing to do. They have expressed extreme concern to me, and I think there's some legitimacy to this, that depending on how in the administration's proposal we address these capital and margin requirements, they're concerned, and I think legitimately, that potentially they would be driven, because they still need the price stability. They've got to have the product. If we dramatically increase capital or margin requirements or place them in a fashion that's counterproductive, they'll be driven to the biggest financial institutions, because they'll have to have someone who can afford to not only engage in the contract with them, but who can finance all these other options to at a fee. Once again, the fear being, Secretary, that they'll wind up having fewer people to do business with, and it will be a small handful of the biggest, which runs contrary to, I think, what we've been saying on this side of the aisle, which is too big to fail is unacceptable, untenable. But yet there are real concerns out in the countryside that these pieces of legislation as proposed will drive more business to the biggest, will put the biggest at an even greater advantage over everyone else. So let's visit for a moment about the practical consequences about these issues.
I understand both concerns, and I agree with much of what you said about them. On the cost issue for community banks, we think we found a way, but I think the Chairman's note is helpful clarification on this to give people reassurance that we can do this change in authority, reallocation of authority, without increasing costs. And I think that's an important thing to do. And I think that's achievable. Again, it's not that there are no people in the country who are doing this job now. It's just they're spread across a bunch of agencies, and we want to take that authority and consolidate in a place where it can be done with less distraction. But I understand the question. I think that's the concern. I think we can achieve what is important to you and to those community banks. On the derivatives thing, I also think you said it well. Again, we very much want to make sure we preserve the capacity of people in many different industries to use derivative markets to hedge them, protect themselves against the risks they confront. And we've tried to provide a way to do that, gives them comfort for that, but obviously happy to work with you and your colleagues and with the SEC and the CFTC of how to provide the clarification and assurance necessary, because again, we want to preserve that. Of course, the challenge, again, as I said, is to do that without creating, just a huge loophole that allows people to evade the basic protections we think the country needs. But I think you framed the concern right, and we're very much willing to work with you all on how to do that.
Because after all, Secretary, in my region, we went through both an agricultural and energy property boom, bust, and bubble in the 1980s. We were slaughtered economically. We did not receive capital injections. Our industries were not propped up. It took us 10, 15 years in some segments to recover from it. We don't wish that on anyone else, but by the same token, let's not make the matter worse, because the view back home is it was the big boys that damn near killed us all,
Right.
not the little players.
Right. And I think you're right. Again, people who provide that protection, write those commitments, whatever the form is, they need to hold margin and capital so it allows them to meet those commitments. And that was the big failure in the system.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
The gentleman from North